The apartment had once been bright, its windows tall and wide, casting generous daylight across the wood floors and pale walls. But now it felt like the sun had forgotten it. Dust lingered on the windowsills, and fingerprints smudged the glass panes. The air held that subtle, stale heaviness of a space too long untouched by movement or laughter. Lucas moved slowly through the living room, his bare feet brushing against scattered sketches and half-rolled scrolls of unused canvas. His fingers trailed across the back of the couch, pausing on the coffee mug he'd left there 3 days ago. It still held a cold, amber inch of tea, untouched since that sleepless night. He hadn't had the heart to toss it. He had once loved creating. Faces, landscapes, quiet moments suspended in ink and watercolor. But now nothing came. The lines on his paper felt tired, uninspired. His mind wandered too much and landed nowhere useful. Ever since the breakup, time had shifted, not stopped, but slowed into something thick and difficult to step through. Lucas hadn't seen many people lately. Food deliveries were left at the door, texts went unanswered, and calls were silenced. His apartment had become both fortress and prison, cluttered with memories he didn't want to face. Pictures on the wall, once meaningful, now felt like cruel artifacts from a life he couldn't re-enter. He stood in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed over his chest, staring at the sink full of dishes. They weren't just dirty, they were symbolic. A record of the weeks he hadn't cared. The fridge hummed quietly, offering no comfort. Even his cat, who had once curled beside him faithfully, now preferred the sunlit edge of the bedroom window. The decision to call a cleaning service hadn't come easily. He'd hovered over the website for hours, cursor circling the booking button like a plane too hesitant to land. But eventually he clicked, not because he expected transformation, but because he needed movement, however small. The confirmation email had arrived quickly. Tomorrow, between 9 and 11 a.m. Your assigned cleaner, Aiden. Just a name. No image, no details. That anonymity comforted Lucas more than it should have. That night, he didn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet creaks of an old building breathing in the dark. Every so often he'd hear the fridge hum or a car pass in the distance. But mostly it was stillness. Not peaceful, but echoing, dense. When morning came, he barely moved. He drank his coffee standing up, too tense to sit, wearing an old t-shirt and joggers. He thought about changing, thought about shaving, but did neither. Would it matter? At exactly 9:14, there was a knock on the door. He froze. His heart did that strange stutter it hadn't done in months, the kind that said someone is here. Not a ghost from memory, not a message on a screen. A real person. Here. Now. Lucas walked to the door with the caution of someone approaching a wild animal. He cracked it open, saw the cleaning uniform, the name tag, the eyes. Green? No, maybe gray-green. Sharp. Awake. Aiden. Lucas opened the door fully and stepped aside without speaking. Words felt too heavy. He gestured inside with a quiet nod, then turned and walked toward the living room without looking back. He didn't know what he had expected, but it wasn't the silence that followed. No questions, no awkward small talk, just the sound of a bag unzipping, a spray bottle releasing a gentle mist, a rag brushing across surfaces untouched in weeks. Lucas sat on the edge of his couch, pretending to scroll through his phone while watching Aiden out of the corner of his eye. There was something steady about him. No rush in his movements, no judgment in his eyes. He was efficient, yes, but not cold. He moved like someone used to silence, someone who had learned how to listen to spaces rather than fill them. An hour passed, maybe 2. Lucas wasn't sure, but the apartment started to look lighter, not drastically different, but the surfaces were visible again. The air felt less stagnant. Aiden didn't speak, but every so often his gaze would meet Lucas's, brief but not dismissive. It was like he was acknowledging his presence without requiring anything in return. Lucas realized, with quiet discomfort, that he had been holding his breath, that somewhere deep down he had been afraid, not of the mess being seen, but of himself being seen through it. But Aiden didn't flinch. He didn't linger over the drawings or the empty bottles. He simply cleaned, gently, respectfully, as if he understood without needing to ask. By the time the cleaner packed his things, Lucas felt something he hadn't felt in months, a quiet ache for someone to stay. He didn't say it, couldn't, but as Aiden stepped toward the door, Lucas stood. Their eyes met, and in that glance, something subtle passed between them. Not a question, not a promise, but a beginning, delicate, silent, and entirely unexpected. Lucas had never liked being watched while someone worked in his space. It made him feel exposed, as though every object in the room became a reflection of his failures. Yet with Aiden, there was no discomfort. There was only stillness, and a strange, fragile sense of ease he couldn't quite name. The apartment breathed differently that morning. Maybe it was the open windows, or maybe it was Aiden himself. There was something careful about the way he moved through the space, almost reverent, as if the rooms meant something to him, even though he was a stranger to them. He didn't disturb anything unnecessarily. His gloved hands paused before touching personal items. His gaze never lingered too long on the framed sketches or scattered notes. Lucas stayed mostly in the living room, eyes fixed on his sketch pad, though his pencil barely moved. Every once in a while, he glanced toward the hallway where Aiden worked, moving from the bedroom to the kitchen, never rushing, never dragging. There was a calm, grounded energy to him that made Lucas aware of his own restless stillness. The quiet between them wasn't awkward. It was full, filled with motion, with subtle sounds. The rustle of paper towels, the soft thud of a cleaning caddy being set down, the muted hiss of a spray bottle releasing citrus-scented mist. Time passed without tension. In the kitchen, Aiden wiped the counters with long, fluid strokes. He arranged a small pile of scattered cups without comment, rinsed them, then placed them carefully on a drying rack as though they were delicate artifacts instead of chipped porcelain. Lucas watched from the hallway, arms crossed loosely over his chest, silently absorbing the scene. He tried to recall the last time someone had entered his world and not try to change it. Aiden wasn't trying to fix him. He was just present. That thought sat heavy and warm in Lucas's chest. At one point, Aiden passed by the living room doorway with a folded towel in his hands. Their eyes met just for a second. No words, no smiles. But Lucas felt something subtle pass between them, acknowledgement, a kind of understanding that didn't require sound. Later, when Aiden stepped into the studio, the only room Lucas hesitated to let others enter, he paused at the doorway. Not out of confusion, but respect. Lucas noticed. Without meaning to, he stood up and nodded slightly, giving silent permission. Aiden entered quietly, eyes scanning the space. It was a mess of ideas, sketches pinned to the walls, unfinished canvases stacked near the window, an open sketchbook filled with half-formed thoughts. There was no judgment in Aiden's expression. He moved slowly, dusting along the shelves, careful not to disturb a single sheet of paper. He didn't ask about the drawings. He didn't mention the small photo frame turned face down on the desk. Instead, he simply cleaned. Lucas leaned against the doorframe and watched. It felt oddly intimate, seeing someone interact with the parts of his world he usually hid from others. Aiden worked in silence, humming softly under his breath. Not a song Lucas recognized, but something soothing and simple. When Aiden reached the corner where old sketchbooks had been left in disarray, he crouched to straighten them. One slid loose, falling open to a page that caught his eye. It wasn't scandalous or dramatic, just a charcoal drawing of a man's back, partially turned, mid-motion. The lines were strong yet delicate, purposeful yet full of emotion. Aiden looked at it for just a second longer than necessary. Lucas saw that too. Still, Aiden didn't comment. He closed the book carefully and placed it back with the others. That small act, respectful, unintrusive, made something shift in Lucas's chest. It had been so long since someone treated his art like it mattered without needing to say it aloud. The apartment was starting to look less tired now. The air had changed. It was subtle, but undeniable. And so had Lucas. Not dramatically, but a quiet thread had been pulled loose somewhere inside him, unraveling just enough to let a sliver of air in. By the time Aiden stepped back into the hallway, Lucas was sitting at a small table near the window, a pencil finally moving across the page. He wasn't drawing anything specific, just letting the motion carry him. Aiden passed by on his way to gather his supplies, pausing just briefly beside Lucas's chair. Their eyes met again. Still no words. But this time, Lucas nodded, not just to acknowledge him, but as a quiet thank you. Aiden returned the gesture, just a small tilt of the head. Then he turned away, his steps soft, his presence lingering like the scent of clean linen and something warmer, something human. Lucas watched him disappear into the other room and felt the corners of his mouth lift just slightly. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the closest he'd come in weeks. He didn't know what was happening, didn't know what this man would mean in the days to come. But in that silence, in those brief glances and gestures, something had begun to shift. And for the first time in a long while, Lucas didn't feel so alone in his own home. The next time Aiden came, the light in the apartment felt different. Lucas hadn't touched much since the last visit, but it wasn't just the absence of clutter that lingered. It was something softer, something he couldn't name. The shadows in the corners didn't feel so heavy, and when he opened the door and saw Aiden standing there again, there was no hesitation. No tension in his shoulders, no awkwardness in his breath. Just quiet anticipation. Aiden entered with the same quiet grace. His tools in hand, uniform simple, expression neutral but kind. He nodded once, and Lucas stepped back, letting the door close behind them. There were no instructions. No need. Aiden remembered the layout, remembered what needed attention. But this time, his steps were slower, his eyes lingering just a bit longer on the details around him. Lucas retreated to the studio. He didn't try to sketch this time. He simply sat in the large armchair by the window, legs folded under him, watching the light play across the hardwood floor. Somewhere in the kitchen, he could hear the familiar rhythm of movement. Soft clinks, subtle sprays, footsteps padded by care. He found himself listening to that rhythm, letting it fill the silence in a way music never could. At some point, the footsteps came closer. Lucas glanced up to see Aiden standing in the doorway to the studio, holding a damp cloth. He didn't speak. He didn't even gesture. He simply looked, asking, without words, whether he could come in. Lucas gave the smallest nod. Aiden stepped inside and moved toward the desk, where a thin film of dust had returned to the surface. As he wiped it away, his fingers brushed the edge of sketchbook, the same one he had seen before. It sat slightly ajar, its pages still vulnerable to wandering eyes. He paused only briefly, then closed it gently, his fingertips resting for a second longer on the worn cover. Lucas watched from the chair, his gaze steady. He didn't flinch this time, didn't try to hide it. That book had once been filled with drawings of someone he loved, someone who had walked away. He had tried to forget, but memory lived in pencil lines and paper fibers. Aiden didn't ask about it. He didn't need to. Instead, he continued dusting, moving along the windowsill, pausing only to shift a few frames that had been tilted by time or neglect. One of them held a photo, a younger Lucas, arms slung around someone taller, both of them smiling with the kind of ease that no longer came naturally. The frame had been placed face down during his worst months. At some point, Aiden had turned it upright again, and Lucas hadn't corrected it. Now, Aiden picked it up gently, wiped the glass, and set it down as it was. Upright, present. There was a kind of reverence in that small act that Lucas felt like a breath in his chest, as though something sacred had just been honored without fanfare. As Aiden moved to clean near the armchair, Lucas stood and stepped aside, giving him room. Their shoulders passed close, not touching, but aware of each other. The air between them stirred, charged with something unsaid. Lucas moved toward the bookcase, pretending to organize a few art supplies while Aiden worked near the window. There was a moment, brief, invisible to anyone else, when their hands reached for the same pencil jar. Their fingers didn't meet, but they paused, suspended a heartbeat longer than necessary. Neither of them looked away. Lucas let go first, retreating with a soft breath, pretending it hadn't happened. But inside, something fluttered. Not panic, not shame, just a flicker, like the first spark of recognition after a long winter. Later, Aiden returned to the hallway to gather supplies. Lucas, left in the studio, found himself walking over to the desk. His eyes fell to the sketchbook. He opened it slowly and flipped past the older pages, past the memories that still carried weight, until he reached a blank one. He stared at it for a long while. Then, with a quiet certainty, he picked up a pencil and began to draw. Not a portrait, not a face, just a shape, a shadow, the outline of a figure in motion. Broad shoulders, the suggestion of soft curls. No labels, no intention, just instinct. When Aiden returned to collect his things, Lucas remained seated, pencil still in hand, the drawing only half formed. Aiden glanced at the page, but said nothing. He didn't have to. His expression softened, and he gave the smallest tilt of his head, a silent understanding shared between people who had lived with ghosts. As he moved to leave, Lucas followed him to the door. He didn't plan it. It just happened. Aiden paused with one hand on the handle, then looked back. Their eyes met again, no longer strangers, but still something less than friends. Something becoming. And for the first time, Lucas felt that maybe what he had lost wasn't gone forever. Maybe it had just been waiting for the right moment, the right silence, the right person. The fourth visit didn't feel like work anymore. Lucas hadn't expected to feel anything at all. But that morning, as he adjusted a cushion on the couch and set out 2 mugs instead of 1. Not that he planned on offering tea, not directly. There was a quiet stir beneath his skin, like a current moving beneath still water. The apartment looked different now. Not because it was cleaner, though it was. It looked like it had been seen, as though Aiden's presence had left behind something more than order. Something invisible but tangible, like warmth after someone leaves a room. Lucas waited, pacing slowly between the hallway and the kitchen, pretending to check small things. Light switches, dishes. He wasn't nervous, but he wasn't calm either. His breath came a little too deliberately. His hands moved a little too much. When the knock came, he opened the door with less hesitation. Aiden stood there as always, quiet, composed, with a slight nod of greeting. But this time, something lingered in his eyes. A softness, perhaps, or familiarity. Lucas stepped aside. The routine was wordless now. Aiden entered, removed his shoes at the door, and moved toward his supplies with his usual quiet efficiency. But today, he paused longer at the threshold of each room. As though he wasn't just cleaning a space, he was walking into a story already in progress. Lucas didn't retreat to the studio this time. He remained in the living room, seated at the far end of the couch with a sketchbook in his lap. Not drawing, just watching, listening. Aiden began in the kitchen. The gentle rhythm of his movements filled the space like music. Spray, wipe, rinse, fold. The mundane transformed into something meditative. And Lucas felt himself breathing in time with those sounds, grounding in the cadence of someone else's steadiness. Time passed like that, unmeasured but felt. The kind of time that doesn't need clocks. When Aiden moved to the living room, Lucas shifted slightly, giving him space but not leaving. He watched as Aiden cleaned the shelves, the windows, the corners where dust liked to gather in defiance of light. There was a grace to his movements, a choreography shaped by years of repetition and quiet pride. At one point, Aiden turned to adjust the curtains. As he did, the soft sunlight fell across his face, catching the curve of his jaw, the edge of his collarbone, the brief glint in his eyes. Lucas's breath caught, not dramatically, just slightly, enough for him to realize that he'd been watching too closely. Their eyes met. It was not a long look, but it was steady. Lucas glanced away first, his fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the sketchbook. Aiden said nothing. He simply turned back to the window and continued his work. Later, as the apartment settled into the hush of late afternoon, Aiden returned to the kitchen. Lucas followed, almost without thinking. He leaned against the doorway while Aiden wiped down the table, the soft cloth moving in smooth circles. Neither of them spoke, but the air between them felt heavier, not uncomfortable, but charged, like something was waiting to be acknowledged. When Aiden turned to rinse a cloth at the sink, Lucas moved toward the counter. He opened a cupboard and took out 2 mugs, the ones he had set aside earlier, pretending it was accidental. He filled them with hot water and placed a tea bag in each. Still no words, but he set one gently on the table and slid it toward the side where Aiden usually packed up his supplies. Aiden looked at the mug, then at Lucas. Their eyes met again. Longer this time. Lucas didn't explain. He simply sat down on the other side of the table and wrapped his hand around his own cup. Aiden sat as well. Slowly, quietly. For several minutes, they said nothing. Steam curled lazily from the cups between them. Outside, a car passed in the street. Somewhere upstairs, a door closed. But here, in the soft hush of the kitchen, there was only breath and heat and silence. And something else. Something unfolding. Lucas looked at Aiden's hands. They were strong, practical hands, hands that worked but didn't rush. There was a small scar near the base of his thumb. A paint smudge on one knuckle. Lucas realized he wanted to draw them, not just to capture them, but to remember how they looked in stillness. Aiden raised his mug and took a slow sip. When he set it down again, his gaze lifted, not to the room, not to the ceiling, but directly into Lucas's. That was the moment it changed. Not a confession, not a grand gesture, just an understanding. A gentle exhale of recognition. The space between them had shifted, and neither of them moved to change it back. The mug sat empty in front of Lucas, its warmth long faded, but he hadn't moved. Across the table, Aiden remained seated, fingers resting lightly on the rim of his own cup. Neither had spoken in a while, but it didn't feel like silence anymore. It felt like something was being said, slowly, without words. The late afternoon light filtered in through the windows, soft and gold, casting long shadows along the floorboards. Dust particles danced in the air, but they didn't feel like signs of neglect. They felt like presence, like proof of time spent in stillness. Lucas studied the way the light brushed against Aiden's cheekbone, how it caught in his lashes. It wasn't observation anymore. It was memorization. Eventually, Aiden stood. The sound of the chair moving felt louder than it should have. Lucas looked up, a tightness forming in his chest. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't panic. It was simply the realization that time, even this kind of time, kept moving. Aiden began to gather his things, methodically returning each item to its place. Spray bottles, wipes, gloves, everything folded, zipped, and packed. Lucas watched from his seat, unmoving. His hand rested on the table, his fingertips idly tracing the grain in the wood, as though stalling the inevitable. He didn't know what to say, didn't even know if he should say anything. The room felt fragile, like a bubble that could burst with a single wrong word. And yet, the weight of unspoken things sat heavy in his chest. Aiden slung his bag over one shoulder and turned toward the door. Lucas rose to his feet. Their eyes met again, a rhythm they had learned without practice. This one was longer, held open. Something in Lucas resisted. His hand lifted slightly, as if to reach out, but stopped halfway. His throat tightened, and when he spoke, it was quieter than he expected. "Do you have to go right now?" The words hung in the air, simple but raw. He didn't mean them to sound like a plea, but they did. Aiden paused, his hand still on the strap of his bag. There was a hesitation in his stance, not out of discomfort, but consideration. Then, gently, he let the bag slip off his shoulder and set it down. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Lucas motioned slightly toward the living room, and they walked there together, slowly, as though each step carried more meaning than it should. The couch waited, the cushions slightly indented from the last time Lucas had sat there, alone. Now they sat side by side, not touching, not speaking, but closer than before. The space between them hummed with quiet awareness. Lucas leaned back, his gaze drifting to the ceiling. "I don't usually let people in," he said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think I wanted to." Aiden remained still, listening. Lucas's fingers brushed against the seam of the cushion. "But then you came in and didn't ask questions. You just were here, and I didn't feel invisible." A long pause followed. Aiden turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable, but his presence steady. The warmth of him, just inches away, was grounding. Lucas could feel it. Not heat from skin, but from being seen. They sat like that for a long time. The sun lowered behind the rooftops, and the golden light faded into a soft, diffused gray. Outside, the world continued. People walking, cars moving, lives overlapping. But in that small apartment, time seemed to curl inward, as if the room had made space for something gentle to grow. Lucas's shoulder brushed against Aiden's. Barely, a whisper of contact. Aiden didn't pull away. Neither of them moved. There was no grand declaration, no final act. Just the stillness between two people who, somehow, had found each other through the quietest means. Eventually, Aiden shifted, not to stand, not to leave, just to rest more comfortably beside Lucas. The gesture was small, but it held weight. Permission. Peace. Lucas let out a slow breath. He didn't need anything else. Not that night. Not right away. Just this moment. Just the fact that he wasn't alone on the couch anymore.